Hello, friends. Welcome to Storycraft. On this channel, you will enjoy world-top stories. Let's view the video. The Gladiator Who Became Emperor, From Slave to Sword. The Rise of a Gladiator. A storm of chains. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and iron. The sun beat down mercilessly on the chained prisoners as they were herded through the narrow streets of a Roman outpost. Among them walked a young man with fire in his eyes. His name, once spoken with pride in a distant village, had been reduced to a whisper among slaves. Betrayed, captured, and sold into servitude, his fate was sealed, or so they thought. The arena beckons, dragged to the training grounds of Ludus, Rome's brutal gladiator school. He was thrown into a world where only strength, cunning, and will could keep a man breathing. The lanista, a retired warrior turned trainer, saw something different in him. Not just muscle, not just rage, but purpose. The kind of fire that either kills a man or crowns him a legend. The other gladiators mocked the newcomer. To them, he was nothing but a fresh lamb awaiting the slaughter. But he didn't break. He didn't speak. He learned. He watched. Every move, every strike, every failure, etched into his memory like scars on his back. Blood and brotherhood training was merciless. Bones cracked, flesh split, and many fell before even reaching the sands of the arena. Yet he endured. Day by day, his body hardened, his reflexes sharpened. He made no friends until he saved one. During a sparring match that turned lethal, he pulled another gladiator from the edge of death. That man, named Titus, became his only ally, his brother in chains. Titus taught him the rules of survival. Never trust a crowd, never turn your back, and always kill when the gods demand it. Together, they rose through the ranks of the Ludus, leaving a trail of broken rivals in their wake. First blood, then came the day, the first real match. The arena roared like thunder as the gates opened. The scent of blood hung heavy in the air. He stepped onto the sand, facing a towering brute armed with a hammer the size of his chest. The crowd wanted a spectacle. They would get one. The fight was chaos. Dust rose with every blow. He dodged, countered, and finally, as the hammer slammed into the ground and stuck for a moment too long, he drove his blade deep into the giant's side. The roar of the crowd shifted, from bloodlust to awe. A nameless slave had felled a champion. A name reborn. The crowd chanted louder and louder, not the name he was given as a slave, but the name he once carried with honor. The lanista, watching from the shadows, whispered it with a grin. Cassius. In that moment, the chains didn't fall from his wrists, but something inside him snapped free. He was no longer just a slave, no longer just a fighter. He had tasted the power of survival, and now he hungered for more. This was only the beginning. Blood and sand, surviving the arena. The call of the arena. The gates rumbled open once again. The roar of the crowd surged like a tidal wave. This wasn't just another fight. It was a spectacle, a celebration of Roman glory. Cassius, now no longer the nameless slave, stood in the shadows, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes upon him. His pulse quickened. This was what he had trained for. This was the moment that could define his life. Beside him, Titus gripped, his sword tight, his knuckles white. Remember what we've learned, brother, he whispered. Out there, There are no friends, no mercy, only the blade. Cassius nodded, the faint echo of the gladiator's chant still ringing in his ears. The crowd was calling for blood, and he would deliver, the arena of death. The gates clanged shut behind them. The sand beneath his boots was cold and unforgiving. Cassius glanced around the arena. Massive stone pillars surrounded the combatants, the crowd rising in a frenzy of cheers and jeers. His opponent, a hulking man, stood opposite, wielding a massive trident and a net, the typical weapon of a retiarius, a fisher of men. Cassius's breath was steady. His hands shook, but it wasn't fear. It was excitement. He knew the stakes. He'd seen many men fall here, some who had been better fighters, others who had been too weak to survive the ruthless arena. But survival wasn't just about skill. It was about will. The dance of death, the trumpet blared. The fight began. Cassius darted to the left, keeping his movements light and nimble. The trident whipped through the air, a deadly extension of his opponent's will, but Cassius was faster. He ducked, the sharp point slicing past him by inches. The crowd howled, leaning forward in anticipation. He closed the distance between them, but the retiarius was no fool. He threw his net with deadly precision. Cassius rolled to the side, but the net caught his leg, dragging him down to the sand. The crowd erupted. The weight of the net was suffocating, but it wasn't the net that held him down. It was the panic, the instinct to give in. But Cassius had learned something in the months of brutal training. Panic kills faster than any sword. With a deep breath, he ripped the net away, kicking it off his body. The gladiator had only one chance, either to break free or die trying. The moment of truth, with one fluid motion, Cassius sprang to his feet and drew his sword. The retiarius lunged with the trident. Cassius ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and in a heartbeat, he was at his opponent's side. The crowd screamed as he struck, the blade sinking deep into the side of the retiarius, a clean, precise thrust. The massive man crumpled to the sand, his weapon falling from his grip. Blood soaked into the golden sand, painting it crimson. The horror crowd went wild, chanting his name, as if the gods themselves had given him the strength to overcome death. Cassius stood over the fallen gladiator, his chest heaving. For a moment, the world felt still. The roar of the crowd became a distant hum in his ears. The fight was over, but in that instant, he knew that he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just surviving. He was becoming something more. Price of glory. As the gate opened, and Cassius was ushered from the arena, the reality of the victory set in. The cheers of the crowd echoed in his ears, but all he could hear was the quiet hum of the world outside the arena, the world that now seemed so far away. He was a gladiator, a killer, a man who danced on the edge of death for the amusement of others. And yet, there was a taste of victory on his tongue, a taste that made him crave more. Titus clapped him on the back, his grin wide. You did it. Cassius. They'll remember your name now. But Cassius knew better. The crowd's love was fleeting. In the arena, survival was all that mattered. The path ahead was still steep and treacherous. Yet, in that moment, he felt something stirring. Within him, a hunger that could not be satisfied by blood alone. Something deeper, something that had been awakened by the roar of the crowd. This was only the beginning. Whispers of rebellion, The Gladiator's secret plan. The seed of rebellion. The nights in the ludus were long. The silence oppressive. Cassius lay awake on his straw mat, staring up at the stone ceiling, his thoughts racing. The taste of victory had quickly turned sour. He was still a slave, still a pawn in the games of the powerful. The crowd cheered, but they didn't care who he truly was. They saw only the fighter, the gladiator, a man bound by chains of flesh and blood. But there was something deeper in him now, something that had been awakened in the arena, the desire not just to survive, but to break free, to rise above the chains, to become more than the sum of his scars. A silent meeting Cassius had been watching the other gladiators, the workers in the ludus, and most importantly, the whispers that passed like shadows in the dark. It wasn't long before he heard the stories, the rumors of an underground network, men and women who were plotting against their masters. They weren't just slaves. They were revolutionaries, bound together by a single dream: freedom. Titus had noticed Cassius's growing restlessness. One night, as they shared a quiet meal in the dark corner of the barracks, he spoke. "You've been thinking," Titus said softly, his eyes narrowing, "about more than just the next fight." Cassius met his gaze, his voice low. "I'm tired, Titus. Tired of living for their amusement. Tired of being their entertainment. There's got to be more than this." Titus hesitated before replying, his voice just above a whisper. "You're not alone in that. I've heard things that could change everything. The plan unfolds." The whispers grew louder with each passing day. Cassius was drawn into the secret meetings. Late at night, after the other gladiators had fallen asleep, a few of them would gather in the shadows of the training area. They spoke in hushed tones of escape, of revolution, of how they could turn the tables on their masters and claim their freedom. There were men among them who had seen the world beyond the ludus, men who knew of hidden safe houses and rebel camps scattered across the empire. These men had been plotting for years, waiting for the right moment, the right leader to rise. Cassius was their leader now. He didn't seek their loyalty. He didn't demand their obedience. He had earned it through his strength, his skill, and the fire that burned in his chest. Building the Brotherhood. It wasn't just gladiators who joined the cause. Servants, trainers, and even the cooks in the ludus became part of the movement. The plan was simple, yet dangerous. They would escape during a scheduled battle in the arena, a grand event where the emperor himself would be watching. The chaos of the fight would provide the perfect cover for their rebellion. But it would require careful timing, immense courage, and above all, trust. Cassius knew that the fight of his life wasn't going to happen in the arena. It would happen on the streets of Rome. And the price of failure was death. Not just for him, but for every soul who had chosen to follow him. The final decision. The morning before the grand battle, Cassius stood alone in the courtyard of the ludus. The sun was rising, casting long shadows over the sand. His heart beat in his chest like the pounding of war drums. The rebellion was no longer a distant dream. It was real. The time for talking was over. The time for action had come. He thought of his fellow gladiators, men who had lived and died for this moment. He thought of the faces of those who had trusted him with their lives. He thought of the slaves who had once been his brothers in chains. They were all depending on him now. "You ready, Cassius?" Titus's voice broke through his thoughts. His friend's face was grim, but there was a spark in his eyes. Cassius turned to him, his expression fierce. "Ready. We either die as slaves, or we die as men." Titus nodded. "Then let's make sure we're remembered." The calm before the storm. As the gladiators gathered for the grand battle, Cassius felt the weight of the moment. This was more than a fight for glory. It was a fight for everything he had ever wanted, for freedom, for dignity, for a future beyond the blood-soaked sands. But as they were led into the arena, with the emperor's eyes upon them, Cassius's gaze swept over the crowd. It was time. The plan had begun. The whispers of rebellion would soon become a roar. There would be no turning back. Steel meets crown, the battle for Rome, a city on the edge. The gates of the arena slammed shut behind them. Cassius could hear the thunderous roar of the crowd echoing in his chest. This battle wasn't just about survival. It was about everything he had fought for. The rebellion was no longer a secret. The empire would soon feel its tremors. Rome was a powder keg, and he was the spark. The emperor's box loomed high above, a place where only the most powerful could sit. Today it was a place of judgment. Cassius felt the weight of 1,000 eyes watching his every move. But it wasn't just the emperor's gaze that weighed on him. It was the gaze of every gladiator, every rebel, and every slave who had dared to dream of freedom. This fight would be their chance, their reckoning. The enemy in the arena. Cassius's hand gripped his sword tighter as he sized up his opponent. He wasn't just facing another gladiator today. He was facing a symbol of Rome's power, an elite soldier of the emperor's own guard, a man built like a mountain, clad in armor that shone like the sun. He was a beast, and in the eyes of the emperor, he was untouchable. Cassius's mind raced. He had been trained for this, trained to be faster, smarter, more ruthless than his enemies. He knew that this man, as strong as he was not invincible. His arrogance would be his undoing. Cassius wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the future of the rebellion. The first strike. The trumpet sounded, signaling the start of the battle. The emperor's guard charged forward with a brutal swing of his sword, aiming for Cassius's throat. The crowd gasped as the blade whistled through the air. Cassius sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the strike, and countered with a quick slash to the guard's side. Blood sprayed, but the guard barely flinched. The fight was a deadly dance. Each movement was calculated, each strike a test of strength and skill. The emperor's guard was powerful, but Cassius was faster. He darted in and out of range, landing swift cuts while staying out of reach of the guard's heavier attacks. The tide turns. The crowd was on their feet, the energy building to a crescendo. Cassius could feel their anticipation, their bloodlust. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a spectacle. But he wasn't here for the crowd. He was here to make history. The guard lunged again, but this time Cassius was ready. As the sword swung downward, Cassius ducked and swept the guard's legs out from under him. The giant crashed to the ground with a deafening thud. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Cassius's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel it. The moment when everything could change. This was his chance. The final blow. Cassius stood over the fallen guard, his sword raised high. The crowd fell silent, the tension thick in the air. This was no ordinary kill. This was a message, a warning to the emperor and his empire. Cassius's gaze shifted to the emperor's box, where the ruler of Rome sat, his face a mask of indifference. With a single, decisive strike, Cassius drove his blade into the chest of the fallen guard, ending the battle. The crowd erupted into chaos, their cheers deafening. Cassius stood tall, blood dripping from his sword, his chest heaving with the effort. This was the moment the rebellion had been waiting for. A new era begins. As the emperor's guard lay motionless on the sand, Cassius knew that the fight wasn't over. This battle had been won, but the war for Rome had just begun. The emperor would not take this humiliation lightly, but Cassius was ready. He was no longer just a gladiator. He was a leader, and he would lead the rebels to victory, no matter the cost. As he was ushered out of the arena, the crowd's chants filled his ears. But in the depths of his mind, he heard only one thing: the call of freedom. Emperor of the people, a legend is born. The fall of the tyrant. The sun set over Rome, casting long shadows across the city that once stood as the heart of an empire. Cassius stood in the center of the Colosseum, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen enemies, his sword still dripping with blood. The cheers of the crowd echoed in his ears, but the victory was bittersweet. The emperor was dead, his lifeless body discarded at the foot of the imperial throne. Rome had seen its tyrant fall, but what would rise in its place? A nation in chaos. The streets of Rome were filled with chaos. Word of the emperor's death had spread like wildfire, igniting rebellion across the empire. The ruling class scrambled to maintain control, but the people had already spoken. The gladiators, the slaves, and the common folk had risen up, united by a single dream: freedom. Cassius, the gladiator who had once fought for survival, now stood as their leader. The rebellion had not only taken the emperor's life, it had shaken the foundations of Rome itself. A new vision for Rome. Cassius stood before the people, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had not just defeated an emperor, he had given Rome a choice to rebuild, to rise from the ashes of tyranny, and to create a new empire, one where the voices of the people would finally be heard. He raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. Rome is no longer the empire of one man, he declared. It is the empire of the people. We shall rule together in freedom and equality. A legend is born. From that day forward, Cassius's name was etched into history, not as a gladiator, but as the emperor who had freed Rome. His reign would change the course of the empire forever. Thanks for watching. Subscribe our channel Storycraft for more interesting videos.